Hello, Lisa. How are you guys doing? Hope you guys had a great weekend. Hope your moms had a great Mother's Day. Um, Actually, I heard from a friend of mine this weekend. This friend of mine, he was dating this cross-eyed girl. Yeah, but then he found out she was seeing someone on the side. Joke of the day. All right. So for today, we're starting the 1970s. Yes, we're going to go through the 1970s relatively quick, only because there's not that much time left in the school year, believe it or not. And so if we want to get, through the 80s and into the 90s and maybe into the 2000s, we got to hustle along here. Um, so we'll try to go through pretty quick here with the 1970s. So you have that. Yeah, so today we'll start talking about Richard Nixon. The video at the end of this, I apologize, is a little disjointed. So not my best, but what are you going to do? But yeah, so talk about Nixon. And so today we'll talk about that and then um, maybe some other issues with the 1970s, in particular women's rights. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the fall of Nixon, Watergate. We'll probably spend 2 classes next week looking at that. So we'll probably be out of the 1970s by the end of next week. That's the plan. We'll see. Give us more time to do the 80s and the 90s and whatever. Yeah, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the passing of Little Richard, and so that is what your Do Now assignment is today. So make sure with the Do Now you submit a blank document. So I have you for have a record of your attendance. But yeah, Little Richard was great, and so yeah, you get to listen to a little bit of his music and read a little bit about him, and just hopefully have a little bit of fun and bop around your room. Anyway, well, I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and I'll talk to you guys later. Hello. So today we'll kind of finish talking a little bit about Vietnam and then start talking about President Nixon in the 1970s. So, as public opinion turns against Vietnam, President Nixon now tries to figure out how the heck we're going to get out of this thing. He sends Henry Kissinger to start talking with the North Vietnamese um, to kind of bring about some kind of resolution to what's going on. The problem is that the United States has very little leverage, and South Vietnam is reluctant to allow this to happen because they fear once the Americans leave that they'll get run over by the communist North. So you have a very awkward kind of peace process here in which the North, they have no reason to negotiate. They believe they know the American public opinion has turned against the war, so they don't need to acquiesce to anything. And you have the South that is reluctant to go along because they want this, they need the United States to go along. And so what you have here is this weird kind of like give and take. It eventually gets to the point where President Nixon tries to use leverage by increasing the amount of bombing that happens in North Vietnam. And he does this in December, and so anti-war activists refer to this as the Christmas bombing, which you can imagine from a public relations standpoint doesn't look good. But eventually, by 1973, there is a peace agreement that is negotiated. The image you see here is of Americans as well as some South Vietnamese evacuating the American embassy in Saigon. And you can see how hasty that looks. All those people desperately trying to climb onto a ladder, and that is the last helicopter. All those people are not going to get on that last helicopter. And so the final costs of this war you see here in terms of money and lives lost. But it also creates instability in the area. Cambodia and Laos, they're now unstable, and they now will be open up to communist incursion. And in Cambodia, this will lead to the Khmer Rouge, the killing fields, which I believe you've studied previously. And so as we get into the 1970s, trying to get away from Vietnam, and we get President Nixon. And President Nixon is going to try to pivot away from Vietnam by changing U.S. foreign policy. And so he's going to bring back that idea of realpolitik that maybe you remember from freshman year, the idea that our foreign policy needs to connect with our domestic policy, right? That was the problem in Vietnam. People didn't understand why we were there, what was in it for us. So Nixon tries to create a new policy, especially with the Soviet Union, that revolves around this idea of détente, or a cooling of tensions. And so Nixon and Brezhnev, who you see there, sign a series of treaties that limit nuclear weapons, that limit defensive anti ballistic missiles, all again in an effort to kind of calm the situation down and cool tensions. And it does work. Nixon has his biggest foreign policy triumph with China. The US policy towards China since 1949 has basically refused to admit that it exists. So you had a communist country that the United States had zero contact with. We didn't recognize it. We refused to seat it at the United Nations. We had no ambassador there, no embassy, nothing. And Nixon, in a surprise, visits China, formally recognizes China, and Nixon uses this as kind of like a wedge. He sees the Soviet Union and China as the two dominant kind of communist powers out there. And so what Nixon does is he tries to drive a wedge between the two by forging a better relationship with China. He believes that will help the U.S. economy, which he's correct with. Um, as we see today in our current world where the US and China economically are tied very closely together. It is Nixon that does that. And Nixon would have been the only guy who could have gotten away with this. Remember, Nixon, as a politician, began his career as a staunch anti communist. And so, if any other politician had done this, he would have been accused of being soft on communism. But since Nixon had all that street cred as being a communist fighter, um, he could get away with this. The idea that it took, there's actually a phrase in politics that says it took Nixon to go to China, which you see here. The other foreign policy issues that Nixon has to deal with is in the Middle East. And the United States kind of gets embroiled in these Arab-Israeli conflicts that is happening in the area. And in 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel. Israel only survives through American intervention. Nixon sends money and supplies, and Israel manages to hold on. This, of course, draws the ire of Arab countries in the area, as well as Palestinians living in Israel who have an issue with the Israeli government. And so this manifests against the United States in two ways. One is through terrorism, in which Americans now become targets of anti Israel forces in the area. And so Americans find themselves being kidnapped in the Middle East. Americans find themselves being targeted in Europe. The largest kind of terrorist activity that happens during this time period would be the attack on the 1972 Olympics, in which Arab terrorists kidnap members of the Israeli Olympic team and wind up killing them. The other way this kind of manifests against the United States is through an oil embargo. And basically, to kind of get back at the United States, is oil producing nations in the Middle East stop selling us oil. So we have an oil shortage. And this is a potent weapon against the United States. And we have what is known as an energy crisis, in which there's no gas for people to buy. And so people are told that you can only buy so much when it's available, that you can only buy gas on certain days. The government takes stances on things like a speed limit, which we didn't have a national speed limit before, and it's now set at 55 miles per hour. The thought is the slower you drive, the more gas you save. We create daylight savings time. All these things to try to basically save energy. And it is a potent weapon against the United States. The idea that, these small Middle Eastern countries can basically bring the United States to its knees by stopping the supply of oil. And this is something we'll come back to and look at again when we get to the end of this decade.